People coming in, which is a good sign. Okay, I am going to start then. Hello, and welcome to What Does a Foreign Policy for the Middle Class Really Look Like? A co-sponsored event by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and the Center for National Interest. My name is Kelly Blahos, and I am a senior advisor with QI and editorial director for our online magazine, Responsible Statecraft. I am joined by George Beebe, vice president and director of studies for the Center for the National Interest. If you aren't familiar with QI, we are a transpartisan think tank dedicated to foreign policy restraint and diplomacy as a vehicle for U.S. interests rather than the status quo approach of counterproductive power projection and military primacy overseas and a budget-sucking national security state at home. I am really excited about this conversation, for which we have a panel of truly insightful and conservative thinkers, including Daniel McCarthy of Modern Age, Rachel Bovard of the Conservative Partnership Institute, and Michael Lind of the University of Texas. The discussion is launching, of course, from President Biden's pledge to redirect our foreign policy back to the middle class. His administration has talked quite generally about this concept, but the one put forward by his people pretty much used the details found in a September 2020 study by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of the authors being the future National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. The report said that Washington must rebuild trust with the people and find a way in which foreign policy can work for the middle class. It focuses on fair trade and making America competitive on the world stage again, but turning back from an era of regime change abroad. However, it also asserted that its findings found, quote, very little public support for Trump's revolution in US foreign policy and its call to turn back the clock on globalization and international trade, constrain legal immigration, gut foreign aid, abandon US allies, or abdicate US leadership on the global stage, end quote. That said, this should not be over-interpreted as, quote, support for the restoration of foreign policy consensus that guided previous Republican and Democratic administrations. Now, without much detail, beyond putting more money into R&D and technology and addressing global issues that affect us domestically, like climate change, pandemic, cybersecurity, there was a lot of room in the report for interpretation. In fact, as we know on this panel, the problems of our post-Cold War foreign policy goes way beyond Trump or even our regime change wars. And we risk alienating Americans further by putting this problem into nice, neat little boxes. So obviously we have a lot to talk about, and I'm going to turn this over to George now. Again, he is a vice president and director of studies at the Center for the National Interest. He's going to give us a few opening remarks, and then he'll give it back to me, and I will introduce our panel, and we will get to talking. So please take it away, George.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks to the Quincy Institute for co-sponsoring this event with us. I hope this is the first of many co-sponsored events. When I thought about this topic, what does it mean to conduct a foreign policy that reflects the needs and concerns of America's middle class? I thought, it's very telling that we're even asking this question. It's not a question that we really encountered back in the good old Cold War days. We didn't hear a Dwight Eisenhower or a John Kennedy saying, we need a foreign policy that supports the middle class. I think it was really taken as a given for most of the last century that any American foreign policy would serve the interests of America's middle class. I think in part that's because that was a time when nearly every American thought of himself or herself as part of that middle class. And those that didn't, I think, for the most part, aspired to be a part of that class. And this conception of middle America is one that used to embrace an enormous swath of our population, including our schools, our media, our popular culture. And it was hard to imagine, I think, under those circumstances that a foreign policy wouldn't reflect the interests of middle Americans. But the fact that we're asking this question today, I think, reflects just how much has changed over the past several decades. We've lost our unifying geopolitical and ideological enemy, the Soviet Union, and the international communist movement that it led. Universal military conscription has gone away, and we seem to have what some call instead a professional warrior class to which we've outsourced our overseas wars. Congress has changed its role in significant ways, and many people feel it's almost entirely abandoned its constitutional responsibility to determine when our nation goes to war. And globalization, which began several decades ago with so much optimism for helping drive economic growth, not just in the United States, but around the world, has resulted to a great degree in the loss of factories and jobs in middle America. And at the same time, the gap between executive compensation and the pay of rank and file workers has grown enormously. I think it's fair to say that America's middle class is far from what it used to be. And one of the manifestations of this is that there's been a decoupling, in my view, of America's political and business elites from the cares and concerns of ordinary Americans. And many of those elites may look favorably on the prospect of a borderless world, but the bulk of America, middle Americans, I don't believe look at that prospect with quite the same optimism. And I think the past several presidential elections have also indicated that they have real problems with the so-called endless wars that have been conducted for now nearly 20 years. So President Biden is entering his presidency, I think, at a watershed moment in our approach to foreign policy. And he says he wants to reconnect foreign policy to America's middle class. What does that mean? What does he need to do? And how did we arrive at a point where he feels compelled to even proclaim such a goal? These are the questions that I think are before us today. They're not easy questions to answer. I think our panelists are exactly the right people to tackle them. I look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Kelly.
Great, thanks, George. Well, let's get on to it because you've set the table quite appropriately for us, and we have a lot to talk about. So I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and then we'll move on to questions. I'll start with Dan McCarthy. Dan is the editor of Modern Age and editor at large at the American Conservative. He is also the director of the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program at the Fund for American Studies and a visiting fellow at the Center for the Study of Statesmanship at the Catholic University of America. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, USA Today, The Spectator, The National Interest, Reason, and he recently published a volume, Who Rules? Sovereignty, Nationalism, and the Fate of Freedom in the 21st Century. And we have Michael Lind. He is a professor of practice at the LBJ School at the University of Texas and has previously taught at Harvard and Johns Hopkins University. He has been assistant to the director of the study of foreign affairs at the U.S. State Department and has been an editor or staff writer for The New Yorker, Harper's, The New Republic, and The National Interest. His latest book is The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite, and that came out in 2020. Then we have Rachel Bovard. Rachel is the Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute. She previously worked as a Director for Policy Services at the Heritage Foundation and spent a decade on Capitol Hill in the House and Senate, most recently as Legislative Director to Senator Rand Paul and Policy Director of the Senate Steering Committee. She is also a fellow at Defense Priorities and on the board of advisors for the new think tank American Moment. So I welcome you all and thank you so much for joining us at this event and for this important discussion. We're going to take a super long view here, and I want to ask Michael first. You have done a ton of writing lately on class in America, labor and social divisions. And in your 2008 book, The American Way of Strategy, you raise the issue of three potential future American dystopias: the garrison state, the tributary state, and castle society. Can you talk about which of those are the most threatening to the American middle class today, and what a, quote, foreign policy for a middle class would look like to avoid such a fate?
Well, to begin with, I think that we need to question this term middle class. Arguably, as George has said, it flourished in the decades after World War II, when there were multiple routes. There was the old route, which continues to exist, being a college-educated professional or manager. But there was also the route of the more lucky members of the working class could be middle class in lifestyle and in income, largely because of organized labor. What has happened is that the middle class is kind of polarized, with some members moving up into what I've called the overclass, the managerial professional elite, with others moving down into the working class, whose conditions today have less to do with the middle class of the 1950s and 60s than with the working class of the 1910s and 1920s. Whether you look at low wages, broken homes, insecure economics. So we kind of get a reversion to the era of the Gilded Age and the early 20th century with this polarization between elite and working class. As for the three scenarios, these are all three ways that the working class majority, if you want to call it that, can suffer. One is the garrison state, and that is a dictatorial regime which is over-militarized. There have been times, particularly during the Cold War, where I think there were legitimate fears about an excessive garrison state. And even today, there are some disturbing institutions like the Patriot Act and no-fly lists and things like that you see as garrison state features. But I think the greater threats to the majority of the US citizenry, whether you call them working class or middle class, comes from two other dystopias, which in my book, The American Way of Strategy, I called the tributary state and the castle society. The tributary state is a country in which the economic elite decides to sacrifice its sovereignty for economic benefit, often by agreeing to subordinate themselves or to defer to appease, another great power, for economic reasons. I think there are substantial elements of the business community which would have us appease the Chinese regime in order to profit from access to their cheap labor, so they don't have to hire Americans, particularly unionized Americans with good wages. The castle society is what is sometimes called a failed state. It's a country in which the elite basically does not allow the government to enforce basic law and order because it's too expensive. They will pay for protection for themselves in gated communities with private security forces, but the rest of the population can be exposed to rampant crime, terrorism, and so on. And so I think whatever you think the ideal immigration system is, a system in which the US government allows, as happened in a recent month, 40,000 illegal immigrants merely to be released to vanish into the interior of the country, has elements of a failed state, of a castle society to me. But in all of these different dystopias, the working class majority, or the middle class majority, if you want to call it that, pays the price. And the price is lower, or there are actually benefits for the ruling elite.
So Michael, before we go on, in terms of foreign policy, which of those three scenarios do you think best reflects our current moment? And how maybe improving a foreign policy, or at least taking it into a different direction, would get us out of that scenario?
Well, I think the present system is, I don't want to evade your question, but it's kind of a blend. Because when it comes to wars in the Middle East, we sort of have a garrison state. There's constant threat inflation, constant over militarization. When it comes to trade with China, in spite of all these corporations promising administration after administration that they're going to bring back jobs, they don't. They are still dependent on Chinese supply chains, which is incompatible with having a flourishing middle class, because it's not enough, to have high wages. You have to have highly productive supply chains, not complete industries, but high value added production in your country. If you become a pure service economy, you're going to be poor. You will have a lot of poor service workers and a few very rich international bankers and insurance executives and maybe a few tech people. So in manufacturing, we have not decoupled enough from the Chinese economy, in my opinion. And finally, the failed state. Look, immigration is a sensitive issue. We're all descendants of immigrants. But the fact is that the labor force in any country is geographically immobile. Capital is mobile. And if the capitalists cannot transfer production from the labor force in their own country to a cheaper labor force abroad, they can bring in workers from abroad or encourage the government to do so for them to keep wages under check. So there's naturally a conflict between the geographically immobile working class, which wants tight labor markets, and historically the labor movement in the United States has been much more skeptical or hostile to large-scale immigration than the employer lobbies for obvious reasons.
Interesting. Now, I just wanted to say two things before I move on. One, I know we're getting a few questions in the Q&A box, but I just want to remind those out there that you can, plug in a question and we'll try to sprinkle those through the conversation. Also, George, if you want to weigh in on any of this as my co-host, please just put up two fingers and we'll get you in on the conversation as well. So I want to get back to the questions and Dan McCarthy. What about this disconnect that we're hearing both from George and Michael that has sort of fed into this, skewed foreign policy vision that we have that no longer seems to be working for the middle class? Where and when did the trust fall apart? Because I feel at the core there is a lack of trust that the American people have for their government and their institutions. And when did we stop seeing a real cleaving to the Cold War consensus thinking about US being the leader of the free world and the steward of the liberal world order? When did that start to fall apart? Can you give us a sense of the history and maybe the trajectory of where this is all going?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly in the United States at the end of the Cold War, you had several episodes which severely damaged the trust of the American people in their own government. That was true with respect to the way the Vietnam War turned out. It was very much true, of course, of Watergate and the rising crime rates and various, sort of pathologies that took root within our country in the 1970s created a great crisis of confidence. And the Jimmy Carter presidency tended to express that. And you had Jimmy Carter go on television. I don't recall if he actually used the word malaise, but certainly that was the label that got pinned upon his interpretation of what America was going through in the late 1970s. In the 1980s, however, you did have a certain sense of revival, that Americans had a renewed confidence in their country. They still had very strong political disagreements among themselves, but of course, Ronald Reagan did win quite handily in 1980, and then by a landslide in 1984. There seemed to be a sort of recoalescing of confidence in the American political system. Our economy took off in the 1980s. Now, some of that was as a result of a technological boom. Some of it was as a result of changed policies, which wound up in the long run perhaps benefiting the very rich much more than the middle class. But in the 1980s, it seemed as if the rising tide was going to lift absolutely everyone. And in the midst of this, of course, you have such a profound sense of discontent in Eastern Europe with the communist system that you have the final collapse of the system there, and then ultimately in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. This was very much, the Cold War was a conflict between military superpowers, certainly, but the most important levels of the conflict were not military. They were at the level of sort of middle-class prosperity, the idea that the West had something which the East had claimed at the very beginning that it would be able to obtain. It's easy to forget now, but when the communists first took power in the Soviet Union, and then later on, even after World War II, communists often claimed that they would be able to bring riches to the impoverished peoples of the world. And this proved not to be the case. Whereas whenever people looked to the West, they said, wait a minute, it seems as if ordinary families, ordinary middle-class people in the West are in fact prospering. But then also there's the moral level of the conflict, which is vitally important. People simply lost any kind of sense of inspiration from the communist ideal, whereas the West stood for a variety of things. It stood for, on the one hand, religion as opposed to the atheism of the communist bloc. It also stood for the idea of a sort of middle class that was expected to and enabled to keep rising. This idea of you could be a self-starter, you could be someone who was born to humble origins and could rise to something greater. Whereas within the Eastern Bloc, it was much more the case that it was dependent on who you knew, whether you were part of the party, whether you were part of the nomenclatura, et cetera. And so, there was this moral triumph as well as an economic triumph, much more than a military triumph, that saw us through to victory in the Cold War, to success in the Cold War. And in the aftermath of that, people had this continued confidence in the West. And unfortunately, what you saw is that our leadership in the West misinterpreted this as being an endorsement for what they would come to call the liberal international order. And as Michael Lind, in many of his writings, has spelled out, the liberal international order, in effect, was a kind of arbitrage by which you would globalize the economy, you would keep fuel prices down, you would construct massive containerized shipping vessels, and then you would simply move labor and move factories from expensive areas such as the Western world to less expensive areas, including the developing economies of East Asia. And this started, of course, during the Cold War, but it accelerated with the admission of China to the WTO around 2000. And this liberal international order, which is sort of much ballyhooed and celebrated, was in fact a kind of murder of the American middle class. And it has been responsible for the problems we see now. The irony is, of course, that a lot of the foreign policy conflicts of this era, they were part of the liberal international order, but they were attached to the liberal international order's ideology, not to its material interests. So one of the ironic things that Donald Trump was able to do is he went out on the campaign trail in 2016, and he kept saying, hey, wait a minute, if we fought a war with Iraq, why didn't we take the oil? Why didn't we actually materially benefit from this conflict? And of course, that was kind of a shocking thing to say, but at the simple level of ordinary human understanding, it, I think, forced people to confront the idea that these wars for the liberal international order were purely about ideological abstractions and not about actual interest. And if they did, in fact, look at their interests, they would see that their middle class interests were being destroyed by the liberal international order's commitments to China.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, Dan. And do you see that those abstractions continue in terms of our foreign policy right at this very moment?
Well, they do, unfortunately. And I think what Joe Biden is trying to do is to triangulate and sort of try to reform the liberal international order so that it will be more favorably disposed towards the American middle class than it has been over the last 30 years. The problem is that some of the things that are involved in this are in fact going to be detrimental to us. So there's often talk about how we need to smooth over relationships with our allies. Well, in fact, Donald Trump was quite right, both to say that some of our allies are economically taking advantage of us, and also to say that our allies actually need to pay more of their own way for their own defense in things like NATO, for example. So, think about the American semiconductor industry. Well, Taiwan, who is now, a country that we're told by the defenders of the liberal international order, we should be prepared to fight a war to defend against China. Taiwan is, in fact, one of the great beneficiaries of the transfer of the semiconductor industry out of the United States, destroying those American middle-class jobs and putting them into Taiwan instead. South Korea is an ally, But South Korea is, not only a rival in terms of steel. South Korea has basically, sort of taken control of global shipping. Shipping used to be something that America was, sort of renowned for. Now it's something that the South Koreans have a commanding, economic position in. So when we think about whether the liberal international order can be reformed, or whether we have to think of something new beyond the liberal international order, this is one of the key questions. We do need allies. It's good to have allies around the world, but we can't have relationships that allow allies to take advantage of our middle class. And unfortunately, over the last 30 years, and really even into the Cold War, this was something we saw happen all too often. In the Cold War, it was offset by the technological development that was kind of an outgrowth of a lot of the military R&D investments we made. But today, that is no longer the case. And instead, a lot of these allies are in fact our chief global rivals.
Very interesting. Yeah, and it doesn't sound, and you can correct me, that conversation is being had in the administration today. So I mentioned the Carnegie Endowment report on foreign policy for middle class. Do you sense that these really uncomfortable conversations are actually happening when we're talking about traditional allies being rivals and rethinking, those relationships?
No, I don't think it's happening. Neither at the level of rethinking relationships with our allies, nor at the level simply of reevaluating the overall system and the ideology attached to it. We really do need to think about what it means for America to be a nation state and to be supporting its own people in a very globalized era where, in fact, the greatest threat, in some sense, it's China, because China is a very powerful economic rival to us. But China is not an ideological system like the Soviet Union. It's not trying to export its ideology, at least not in a direct way, not in the same way that the Soviet Union was. Instead, the great force that I think all nation states are now confronting is the force of entropy. And we see both failed states, and semi-failed states, despotic ones, are promoters of entropy. We see that terrorism is certainly a form of entropy. But another kind of entropy is the kind of culture war that we see taking place within our own country right now. And the loss of confidence, even in local institutions, even in things like local police forces, for example. And this, sort of crisis of confidence that's brought about by the apparent dominance of entropy is, I think, the battlefield on which the conflict with China is really going to be fought. So there is, a fear that we're going to have another Cold War like the Cold War we had with the Soviet Union against China. And I think that's a mistake. I think instead what we're facing is really a question of confidence. Are the Chinese able to say that they're not only delivering for a growing segment of their own population, but are they also able to say that they have confidence in their future? We, on the other hand, are we able to say that our people have self-confidence and they have a sense that they are going to keep growing in the future? Or do our people, in fact, feel kind of ashamed of themselves? Do they feel as if they're defeated, that we don't win our wars, and that we can't compete on a global, sort of stage? And of course, a lot of our elite says precisely that. They say, no, Americans, they're too lazy, they're bad workers, we need to import H-1B workers from India. Americans can't do these jobs, Americans are lazy, they don't want to do the jobs. All of these things are basically saying that the Americans are inherently a defective people. And I think you see, a tremendous amount of despair that is in fact actually killing our own people in our own country. And this has tremendous foreign policy implications.
And also has political implications. Rachel, I think among all of us, you seem to have the most experience on the Hill. And I'm very impressed because I know that's a tough place to work, and B, in the current polarization that we face as a nation, it is ground zero on Capitol Hill in terms of the anger and the divisiveness in the politics today. And I was wondering what you thought. I know I keep referring back to this report in the Biden pledge to promote a foreign policy for the middle class. But can you talk a little bit about how viable that is within today's political environment? I mean, we know that both on the left and the right, you have two extremes that are pitted against one another. Do you get a sense that if either parties or factions on the Hill right now, are they even equipped today to represent the concerns of the middle class and the heartland on these issues that we're speaking of? Or do we need a full-scale purge in terms of not only our representatives, but the way we're talking about foreign policy? Is anybody on the Hill actually listening to us? and coming up with real world solutions, as opposed to just trying to, to win combat day to day?
Well, first, I want to say to your question, yes, and then I'm going to say no. And let me explain kind of what I mean by that. So, I think in some respects, everything that we've talked about, the fact that we are even talking about this at all, and that we are now having a conversation here, and I think on Capitol Hill, in which we are now widening the aperture about what a foreign policy discussion even means. Because I think 10 years ago, we were merely talking about dropping bombs, and now we are talking about things like trade and immigration and supply chains, all sort of encompassing foreign policy. And I was reminded recently by a colleague of mine who was saying how lucky we are to be able to actually talk about this, because when he was working in the Senate in the 90s, pushing back against NATO expansion, he referenced the fact that there were literally in both parties 4 senators, 4. And that was the only people that would come out against it. And it was Bob Smith, Jesse Helms, Paul Wellstone, and Russ Feingold. That was it. And so I do think that, the sort of super majority of the uniparty, if you will, has been broken a little bit rhetorically. And we are able to have these conversations in a more meaningful and robust way. Now, that being said, I do think that there is still a very lingering and powerful hold on these conversations by what Dan called the sort of liberal international order and what Professor Lind has called the overclass. I think that very much still plays a very powerful role in checking whenever Congress decides to take up its own agency in these areas, to really come down hard against that. And I would point actually to what's happening in the Senate right now as sort of a case example of this. The Senate is now debating what's called the Endless Frontier Act. It is designed to be a bill, a bipartisan bill by Chuck Schumer, a Democrat, and Todd Young, a Republican, to comprehensively engage China on a competitive basis. That's how the bill is being sold. However, the bill primarily just deals with funding in sort of high-tech research areas, which I would argue is an element of aggressing against China, but not nearly the sort of robust, comprehensive framework that you would need. And there is not, I think, the recognition there needs to be in Congress of that fact. And what I'm talking about, for instance, is, we're not dealing with the fact that China frequently uses our free market against us. Right? They come in and with businesses that they say are private enterprise, which are actually, arms of the state. We're not dealing with their abuse of our student visas, which they frequently use to conduct, both intellectual and corporate espionage. And we're not even dealing with, whether or not we should tolerate Uyghur slave labor in our supply chains. Key areas I think that should be on the table when you're talking about something like China, which I would argue is a massive foreign policy and economic concern for the middle class. I mean, you could go on, right? There's a host of areas that you could deal with if you're actually trying to deal with this from a middle class perspective. 2 other examples I would point to that I think are a little bit instructive here. On the optimistic side, I do think, whereas, again, a decade ago, Congress was not at all willing to hold onto its agency in terms of the foreign policy space, you are seeing, I think, twice during the Trump years, Congress actually sent foreign policy items to him to veto. The first was the resolution of disapproval on the war in Yemen, which the Senate actually passed twice with 7 Republican votes and all of Democrats. And a Democratic House passed as well. And then second, a disapproval resolution on a Saudi arms sale. That is tread on which Congress has feared to go for a long time. But then again, on the flip side of it, if you recall, I think it was in July of 2020, Senator Josh Hawley introduced a resolution of disapproval on the World Trade Organization membership of the United States. And now this is something that is actually ripe for consideration every 5 years. When's the last time we saw that? Never. Right? Congress has had the opportunity to pull the lever to make the case, right? That everything that we've talked about so far, that maybe, the global international order, needs to be checked, that perhaps our membership has not served our middle class interests. Congress has had that opportunity to pull the lever. They haven't done it. And when Senator Hawley did it, there was a collective meltdown. The vote was not going to win, right? I think that was pretty clear from an early whip count. They didn't want to have the vote at all. They did not want to be accountable to that vote, to what it meant, to what it would mean to then have to defend. And so I do think that there still is a very strong sort of grip of sort of the defenders of this overclass international order that hasn't quite gone away in Congress, but I do think the rhetorical dam is breaking. I think it just remains to be seen if there's someone that's able to stand up and actually push it all the way across the finish line.
Is there a way to talk about foreign policy on the left and on the right for members of Congress to talk about it in a way that would convince them to push back against other members who are pushing this liberal internationalist order, who are pushing for more intervention overseas? I mean, are there ways? I know at the Quincy Institute, we are trying to talk about these issues to a transpartisan audience, but do you feel that with the polarization on the Hill right now, that there is a way for Republicans to make inroads just as much as the progressives, say, are on the left? Or do you sense that it's so difficult right now and that maybe foreign policy is just not in the cards given the domestic politics right now?
Well, I think, as unsophisticated, perhaps, as Donald Trump's America First message was, there were elements of it that really resonated. And I think that is a compelling way for members to talk about this, is through the lens of the people that are paying for these things, right? Because we've now undertaken this experiment for 30, 40 years. We have data, we have the ability to say this has worked and this hasn't worked. We have the ability, I think on the Republican side, very much, there's a lot of energy behind this pushback against big business, which in many cases, I think has driven a lot of our, trade policy and a lot of our, focus in that regard. And same with immigration. I think people, at least from where I sit on the right, I think are waking up to recognize, all of these promises that were made haven't necessarily been kept. And in many ways, that rhetoric has been taken advantage of by, significant business interests, significant, foreign interests, and perhaps a reorientation is not unwarranted. And that seems to be compelling within the Republican base and then within, reflected, I think, in the Republican coalition. Now, I don't want to become too optimistic about it because, like I said, rhetoric has a way of not quite meeting reality. But, in the last 20 years, there's a sea change in how people talk about it. And I think that's been effective.
Looks like George has a two-finger.
I wanted to ask our panelists about what seems to be a common thread that's gone through all of our remarks so far, which is that the divide that we seem to have is between an American elite and the masses of Americans, so to speak, when it comes to foreign policy. I just wanted to make explicit that seems to be one of the ideas that we're all agreeing on, and also to ask the question as to whether that in fact is true about the bulk of Middle America. Are Middle Americans polarized on the big issues in foreign policy? Say the way we might have been polarized over Vietnam, back in the old days. Are there stark divides within our society on key foreign policy issues? Or is what we're really talking about here a disconnect between our elites and the bulk of the American people?
Michael, do you want to take that one? Because I know you've written extensively about class issues in this country.
Well, to answer George's second question first, the Chicago Council of World Affairs has been doing studies of elite and mass opinion on foreign policy. And you have a gap that goes back 30, 40, 50 years, if not longer, where, and it's not a partisan gap, it's between the elite and the rest of the population. The elite is more favorable to military intervention, more favorable to liberalization of trade and immigration than the majority. So now the elite interprets this as meaning that the majority of Americans, if they're not reactionary nativist xenophobes and protectionists, don't understand why we need to be in Yemen, for example, fighting one of half a dozen wars. And so the ignorant population has to be kept away from the levers of foreign power. And the other thing that's very influential and Rachel was talking about the kind of establishment mindset. You have to realize that since 1945, several generations of American leaders have been raised taught that the United States, the American people, were responsible for World War II. They don't come out and say this, but they imply it. So, for example, whenever you want to do anything about retaliating against mercantilist foreign trade policies, they say Smoot-Hawley caused the Depression, and the Depression caused Hitler rise to power. Okay, so this, whether it's good or bad, so the American people and Congress caused the rise of Hitler through protectionism. And the other myth that has been drilled into the minds of Democratic and Republican politicians for half a century or longer is that it was the withdrawal into isolationism by the United States after World War I that led to World War II. And these are both myths. No serious economist believes that Smoot-Hawley had any significant effect on the Great Depression. It was a response to the Depression. It wasn't a cause of it. And in terms of the idea that the United States after World War I was going to permanently garrison Germany and France and have a NATO type, that's absurd as well. But it's very difficult in dealing with the older generations in particular, and I belong to them, where they were taught that any move towards economic nationalism will lead to a protectionist spiral that will lead to global depression and World War III. And any withdrawal of the US from any third tier region of strategic interest will set off another spiral leading to World War III. So, essentially you're dealing with people, their answer to everything is, well, you want World War III? That's what you want?
I'd like to talk a little bit about China in that vein. There was some polling recently that indicated that most Americans see China as a primary threat. And we can say that that's probably a culmination of many of the headlines out there, whether it be global pandemic, whether it be the trade issues that Michael had raised, as well as Daniel, and also all of the other headlines about security, whether it be in the South China Sea or the expansionism, the Belt and Road Initiative, all combined to this vision that China is a threat. And I believe, as somebody who's been reporting in this field, that Congress helps it along. As Rachel noted, there are at least two initiatives on the Capitol Hill right now, the Strategic Competition Act, and I forgot the name of the one on the Senate side, that do identify China as a pacing threat and are engaging all levers of government to try to meet that threat. And this is the typical threat inflation that we see, and that always comes with big new budgets for the Pentagon and other parts of the government. Is there a way, maybe I should ask Dan this, is there a way to extricate, the military piece of this, which I do feel is creating a sense of, this, you had mentioned that that Americans feel not so much shame, but low confidence in their country, and that perhaps like this rearing to go and meeting the competition of China might be sort of indulging this sort of nationalistic fervor. But is there a way to extricate this military side from some of these valid trade issues that we need to face? In other words, can we be mindful of not trying to tiptoe into a war here while dealing with some of the economic competition that you guys outline here? Because I'm personally afraid that all of this rhetoric is going to get us into a war, and it will just bolster military budgets and defense contractors as we mobilize for that war. And then maybe all these middle class issues that you raise will end up being ignored.
Well, you've identified a paradox which I think is actually kind of central to the ideology of the liberal international order. So isn't it kind of strange that on the one hand we hear all this hawkish talk about the threat of China, the need to defend Taiwan, the need to have more carrier groups go down to the South China Sea, and yet at the same time we are not in fact decoupling our economic relationships with China. So just the other day, or a few weeks ago, I bought one of the new Apple computers. And I got an email 2 days ago saying that it's now been shipped, it's on its way, and it's shipping directly from Shanghai. We have not, in fact, seen the kind of economic decoupling that you would expect if people actually took seriously the idea that China is a real military existential threat to us. Now, why is that? It's precisely because by hyping the threat in one direction, the liberal international order is able to distract from the real threat in the other direction. So we're going to build some aircraft carriers which are completely useless in a 21st century war. They're just sitting bathtubs. They're massive targets. We're going to build aircraft carriers. We're going to build some, fighter jets which have faulty stealth technology or which have insufficient oxygen for their own pilots. We're going to build all the usual military industrial crap that really doesn't do any good in a real 21st century conflict. But we're not going to talk at all about the fact that overall industrial capacity is moving increasingly towards China, and that certainly industrial workforce is something that is growing in China and is shrinking here. So what we're doing is the exact opposite of what we should be doing. We should be saying, you know what, we don't need to fight a war with China. The Taiwan issue is not our issue to settle. This is like saying that, is China going to tell us how we should settle the Puerto Rican issue? Whether Puerto Rico should be a state or independent. I mean, it's just absurd. So why on earth would we be involving ourselves in the China and Taiwan question? It just doesn't make any sense. So we should be backing off some of that. And, if the Japanese and the South Koreans and others want to get involved in that, that's up to them. Although notably, they generally don't. We should be backing off of that. And instead, we should be talking much more about this economic competition that we have with China, and about the need to bring more of our supply chains and more of the manufacturing jobs that support the middle class back to the West and back to the United States itself. And that, I think, so you see, these are two competing systems. They're two completely competing different views of the world. One of which says, prepare for military conflict, but in the meantime, keep having maximum economic integration. And the other one says, let's have minimum economic involvement with China, and instead also have minimum foreign policy objectives that involve the South China Sea and involve trying to meddle in regional affairs of Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, et cetera.
Yeah, Rachel, is this even possible in today's politics? Can Republicans, for example, talk about focusing on the trade issues that concern them without advocating a hawkish view towards China? And can Democrats do the same? Can they talk, like many of them are, about not having a hawkish approach to China, but at the same time address that there are all these economic issues that are affecting middle-class Americans and the working class today?
Well, this is why I think China presents such a good example of if we are going to have a foreign policy for the middle class, because it is the proxy issue, I think, for how this conversation would need to be had. And I think, as Dan has laid out very well, it's all about the stakes for the overclass, right? When you have this conversation, because the economic questions around China would benefit, I think, in many ways, addressing them would benefit the middle class, but raise the consequences, raise the stakes for all of these interests that we have overseas in China, major business interests. By the way, the bill that's being debated in the Senate, the Endless Frontier Act, which will send millions and millions of dollars to industry, our American industry, to compete with China. There is no parameter, there is no limit on what they then can do with that technology that we fund. And a lot of those a lot of those companies want to access China for economic reasons. So in many ways, unless we address the economic question, I think we are working against our own interest in many ways, because the way China aggresses against us isn't necessarily militarily, it's economically. And until we can focus the conversation through that lens, I don't think we can really have an honest conversation about this. And this goes back to sort of the premise of this discussion, which is the way in which I think our elite interests and elites within our own government distort these conversations away from, I think, what the actual sort of apex of the issue should be, and toward this sort of threat inflation on all these other areas to protect, again, this very nested interest that we have economically with China.
I'd like to go to a couple of the Q&A. We got a bunch of questions in here. Richard Mason had asked early on in the conversation, what would the effect of bringing troops home and stationing them in the US, troop effectiveness, money saved. So he's talking about the current conversation about withdrawing troops from Afghanistan and other parts of the globe. I'd like to protract that question. We have this professional military. We have engaged it for 20 years now. I think it's less than 0.5% of Americans have served in our post 9/11 wars. How does that distort the way that Americans view foreign policy? This disconnect between those who have served, those who have not, the fact that most of us have no skin in the game. Can you talk a little bit about our armed forces and how that plays into a quote unquote middle class foreign policy vision? Who would like to take that question? I don't want to, is there anybody? Dan, I think you could probably answer that question.
Well, I can, but some of the things I have to say here are probably not what the Quincy Institute wants to hear. The military has in fact traditionally been an important avenue for people from the lower classes to get into the middle class. They acquire skills. It's really an alternative to college for a lot of people. And we see this in the enlistment numbers right now, that a lot of the professional military is coming from areas that have been depressed or areas where they have not had the opportunities that wealthier and more affluent areas have had. So there is this paradox. We don't want to have a military as a kind of substitute for college. We don't want to have a military as a job training program. All of that would be absurd. And yet that is in fact one of the functions that our military has, provided during the Cold War, and it continues to provide today. And a lot of the veterans who come home, they will say that they have, and a lot of employers will say they've acquired important skills. Now, not necessarily battlefield skills, but logistic skills, skills about, all sorts of things that then have business applications as well. During the Cold War, I think one of the things we did successfully was that our foreign policy objectives and our middle class economic objectives tended to coincide. And we did a very good job of taking technology which had been developed for military purposes and turning that to dual use civilian purposes instead. It's the opposite of what we often hear with the term dual use, where we're afraid that a nuclear reactor technology is going to be used to create a nuclear weapon. Well, in the Cold War, we took things like GPS, we took computer technology and other things, and turned those from military applications to civilian ones. Right now, it seems as if a lot of our military spending is going into kind of museum piece, things like aircraft carriers, pieces of hardware that are neither militarily useful, nor are they necessarily going to be the kind of technologies like GPS that will bear tremendous civilian benefits in the future. So we need to rethink military contracting and military spending in a way which, it's not going to get rid of it. And in fact, military contracting may still be important for a lot of middle-class manufacturing, but that it will at least have both 21st century military applications, but also civilian applications over the horizon. How you balance these concerns and how you make sure that you don't simply look at the military as having primarily domestic purposes to serve is a challenge. But I think you have to be honest about some of those purposes that in fact it has served, whether it's meant to or not.
Could I add to that?
Sure.
Yeah, I think what Dan is saying is right. Historically, the U.S. in the first two global conflicts, World War I and World War II, had a mobilization strategy. And that arguably reconciled the interests of the middle class and of the American economy. So you had the world's strongest industrial base, civilian industrial base. And then when you declared war, you converted civilian industry to military production. So the Ford Motor Company starts making tanks and airplanes. And you had a mass conscript army for small R Republican reasons, rather than a mercenary military. Particularly in the late Cold War, and even more so after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s. the decision was made to outsource much of our defense industrial base to allies. It wasn't a conscious decision, that China was an adversary that you're outsourcing to. But so you end up with a defense industrial base where the supply chains are scattered among South Korea, Japan, Sweden, Germany, France, Britain, Italy, and so on, all making components going into one weapon system, and then beginning with the end of the draft, you get first a small professional military that's full time. In the forever wars in the Middle East, we've added an outer ring of contractors who quit the professional military and then come back in, working for contractor services. These are mostly U.S. citizens, often veterans of the U.S. military. And then this vast group of proxies, who are armed and trained by the military, the intelligence community, and so on. So what we've done essentially is outsourced both the industrial base and to some degree the personnel base of the U.S. military.
That's right.
And this is a relatively recent phenomenon. And as I say, much of the outsourcing of the U.S. military industrial base took place under, after 1989.
Right.
And this increasing reliance on what objectively are mercenaries is a product of the wars beginning with the war on terror. Right. And unfortunately, it's politically stable because the costs as a share of GDP of these quasi-colonial wars are very low. Let's not exaggerate the costs. They went up to about 6% of GDP compared to an average of about 15% at the peak of the Cold War and 50% in World War II. So they've now gone down again. So you have the cost of these wars fluctuating at a fairly low level, 3-4% of GDP. At the same time, the body bags are not those of U.S. conscripts, much less U.S. leaders, but not even so much working class soldiers, to the extent that you rely on proxies and on professionals. So I'm afraid this is politically a very sustainable system because the costs seem low to the voters.
Right, exactly. They're able to conduct these overseas operations in the shadows, so to speak. And I don't see how you put the genie back in the bottle because, as you said, it's politically supported on both sides of the aisle. And for example, we have tens of thousands of contractors, many of them, U.S. contractors in Afghanistan right now, and probably going to stay there after we withdraw. That can carry on certain things, and including security. And we probably won't read about it again in the newspapers. We only have a few minutes left. I do have an interesting conversation here, question here from Arabella Hosfeld. I'm so sorry that I've skewered your name, but I love your question. She asks, what role, if any, does the elitization of the press corps play in this disconnect of how we view foreign policy? She says 40 to 50 years ago, typical members of the White House press corps and other journalists covering foreign policy were not educated at Yale, Harvard, Columbia, as they are now. Has that resulted in a skewed vision of foreign policy or an inaccessibility for regular Americans to understand our foreign policy and our role on the world stage? Anybody want to take up that question in terms of reporting in the media?
I can start with it. I'm sure other people have answers too, but I think this is you've honed in on something that I think is a great element for, lack of accessibility and explanation for what is actually, and accountability for what is actually being conducted in our foreign policy. And I think the peak example of this probably was, during the Obama years when Ben Rhodes bragged about how he was able to manipulate 27-year-old reporters to publish whatever it was that he wanted in support of the Iran nuclear deal. And I think that was reflective of, a press corps that isn't necessarily, as perhaps specialty educated in foreign policy, but I think, again, less willing to engage in, I think, the intellectual curiosity that used to be the hallmark of good journalism, which I would argue is the core function of good journalism. There isn't really anyone chasing down these stories anymore, but you also have an administration that is just, and I think this is generally speaking, most administrations, not limited to one party, that just refuses to allow access and engagement with the press on these questions like they used to. There were very clear examples under President Trump. Speaking of Afghanistan, now that he's out of office, there's reporting in Axios about how his own generals were trying to undermine his withdrawal. There's the famous example of one of our Syrian diplomats lying to the president about how many American troops were actually in Syria. And, the press corps sort of just reports this as, a news of the day. So I think that's a great question and an item that needs to be addressed.
And we are out of time, and I'm sorry that I didn't get to many of these questions. I think some of these questions that had come in, people at the very core wonder what a middle-class foreign policy would look like. I don't know if we answered that here because it's such a complicated conversation and so many threads involved in it. So I'm afraid we are out of time, and I wish we could go on a little longer because these are questions that I have personally, but I hope that at some point maybe we can reconvene and talk about how the Biden foreign policy, whether or not it lived up to some of the standards that it raised for itself. So thank you very much. George, do you have any parting words?
No, thank you, Kelly. I agree. I think this is an enormously important topic. It's also a huge topic. We've just begun to get into it, and I hope that we can continue this conversation as Biden gets more into his foreign policy and we start to see more clearly some of the choices that are being made.
And thank you, Michael, Rachel, and Daniel for playing along, because I know these were tough questions, or at least questions that didn't elicit a quick soundbite answer. So thank you for all of the insights that you brought to us today.